1942. Barents Sea. The convoy was moving through darkness so cold it seemed to have weight. The sea was black beneath the ships. The sky was almost empty, and the wind came across the decks like a blade. Ice formed wherever the spray landed. On rails, on ropes, on guns, on ladders. On steel decks where one wrong step could break a man's body before the enemy ever appeared. The cold did not arrive suddenly. It gathered. It hardened. It turned ordinary shipboard work into punishment. Somewhere to the north was the Arctic ice pack, a moving wall of frozen danger. Somewhere to the south was German-held Norway. Bases, aircraft, U-boats, warships. And between them, Allied convoys were forced through a narrow frozen corridor. There was no easy road, no safe open sea, no warm southern route for these ships. Only ice above them, Germany below them, and Russia ahead. The Germans did not need the whole ocean. The Arctic forced the convoy into a corridor. From German bases in Norway, this route could be watched, hunted, and attacked. Aircraft could come out of cloud. U-boats could wait beneath black water. Surface ships could threaten from the north, and the weather itself could do what bombs and torpedoes did not. Canadian sailors were there, not on a famous beach, not in a city battle, not in one of the stories most Canadians grow up hearing. They were there in Hitler's frozen convoy war, part of a wider Allied effort to keep supplies moving toward the Soviet Union through one of the most punishing routes of the Second World War. The enemy was not only Germany. The enemy was also the sea, the fog, the darkness, the ice. The freezing water that could kill a man before rescue reached him. The kind of cold that made metal dangerous to touch. The kind of wind that made speech difficult. The kind of weather that turned every watch into an endurance test. And still the convoy moved, slowly, heavily, through water that seemed designed to swallow ships and memory together. The Germans believed this route could be made unbearable. But the convoys kept sailing. The ice was already fighting them before Germany fired a shot. The Arctic convoys existed because the war in Europe had become too large for any single battlefield to explain. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front became one of the largest and most destructive battlefields in human history. Armies collided across enormous distances. Cities burned. Millions fought. Millions died. And the Soviet Union needed supplies to keep resisting. The Allies needed to send material, tanks, trucks, aircraft parts, ammunition, fuel, food, raw materials, everything that could help keep the Soviet war effort alive. But getting supplies to Russia was not simple. The map itself became part of the problem. One route led through the Arctic, to ports like Murmansk and Archangel, a route through freezing seas, long darkness, storms, fog, ice, and German attack. It was one of the fastest ways to send supplies to the Soviet North, and one of the most terrifying. From the German perspective, every ship that reached Russia mattered. A cargo ship was not just a cargo ship. It could carry engines, weapons, fuel, vehicles, food. The means for Soviet armies to keep fighting on the Eastern Front. So Germany wanted the route broken, not delayed, not inconvenienced, broken. This is why the Arctic convoy war became so brutal. The ships were not sailing into the frozen north for drama. They were sailing because war demanded it, because the Soviet Union needed supplies, because the Allied coalition needed the Eastern Front to keep fighting, because every convoy that arrived helped extend resistance against Hitler's armies. But the route had a terrible geography. To the north, ice. To the south, German-held Norway. Ahead, Soviet ports. Behind, the long return through the same danger. It was not just a route. It was a funnel, a place where enemy aircraft, submarines, surface forces, and weather could converge. Canadian sailors and merchant seamen became part of this wider Allied effort. Some served on merchant ships making the Arctic runs. Some served with Canadian naval crews and ships involved in convoy escort operations. But the story must be told carefully. Canada did not carry the Murmansk Run alone. This was a multinational Allied struggle. British, Canadian, American, Soviet, merchant crews from many places, naval escorts from different fleets, all joined by one brutal purpose: keep the route alive. Every ship that reached Russia carried more than cargo. It carried time, time against Germany in the east, time for the Soviet armies to keep fighting, time for the Allies to prepare elsewhere. That is why men were sent through the frozen corridor. Not because it was safe, because it mattered. Canada's war at sea did not stop in the Atlantic. It continued into ice. Most people remember Canada's Navy through the Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy escorts, U-boats, Halifax, black water between North America and Britain. That memory is important, but it is not the whole story. The Arctic convoys were different. The Atlantic was vast. The Arctic route was narrow. The Atlantic was dangerous because of distance. The Arctic was dangerous because the route itself seemed trapped between enemies. Ice above. German-held Norway below. Fog around. Darkness ahead. For Canadian sailors, this meant a new kind of sea war. A war where the cold could weaken a man before combat began. A war where weapons could ice over. Where ropes could freeze. Where visibility could disappear into fog and snow. Where a ship might carry supplies to Russia while every mile brought the chance of attack from air, sea, or beneath the water. Canadian merchant sailors served on Allied ships making these Arctic runs. Canadian naval personnel and ships were also connected to Arctic convoy operations, though the exact ship-by-ship role needs careful sourcing before naming specific vessels. This is important. The story is not that Canada owned the route. The story is that Canadians were there, inside the wider Allied convoy system. Inside the frozen war, most people barely remember. From the German side, nationality was not always the first thing that mattered. A ship was a target because of what it carried. A convoy was a target because of where it was going. The supplies were heading to the Soviet Union. The route passed near German power. That was enough. For Canadians on those ships, the war looked nothing like a famous battlefield. No front line. No trench, no town to capture, no flag raised over liberated ground. Only the sea, the ice, the engines, the watch, the next alarm, the next shadow in the sky, the next report of a U-boat, the next wave breaking over a deck already frozen hard. This was a lesser-known Canadian war, not fought for headlines, not remembered like Juno or Ortona, but crucial in its own way. Because if supplies could not reach Russia, the pressure on Germany in the east became harder to sustain. And if the Eastern Front weakened, the entire Allied war could change. The Canadian sailors sent into Hitler's frozen convoy war were part of that pressure. Not alone, never alone, but present, exposed, cold, and moving through a corridor Germany wanted to kill. Canada's war at sea did not stop in the Atlantic. It continued into ice. The Arctic convoy route was not simply dangerous because it was cold. It was dangerous because geography gave Germany a weapon. To the north, the ice pack pressed downward. To the south, German-held Norway stretched along the convoy's flank. Between them was the lane, a frozen passage, a corridor of black water, fog ice, and waiting enemies. The German side, the route looked vulnerable. The convoys had to move through a space that could be watched, tracked, attacked. Submarines could wait beneath the surface. Aircraft could come from bases in Norway. Surface warships could threaten the northern seas. And the convoy could not simply choose an easier road. This was the trap, not a trap with walls, a trap made of distance, ice, weather, and enemy geography. The ships had to keep moving toward Murmansk and Archangel. They had to carry supplies to the Soviet Union. They had to pass through the zone. Germany wanted to turn into a killing ground. In the Atlantic, a convoy could sometimes feel swallowed by space. In the Arctic, a convoy could feel squeezed by it. That difference matters. The ice narrowed the sea, the weather blinded the crews, the cold weakened the men, and Norway gave Germany a forward position from which to strike. For German planners, every Arctic convoy, every cargo hold might carry material that would later be used against German armies in the east. A tank unloaded in Russia mattered. A truck unloaded in Russia mattered. Fuel mattered. Ammunition mattered. Food mattered. The convoy was not just moving through water. It was moving through the strategic nervous system of the war. That is why Germany wanted the route killed, not merely damaged, not simply delayed, killed. Because if the convoy route became too costly, too frightening, too unreliable, the Soviet supply line would suffer. And if that supply line suffered, Germany could hope that pressure on the Eastern Front might ease. For the Canadian sailors and merchant seamen inside this convoy system, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A shape in cloud, a periscope in gray water, a signal report. A dark horizon, a patch of fog hiding what might be aircraft, a U-boat, or nothing at all. This was a war of waiting. Waiting for the alarm, waiting for the attack, waiting for the weather to clear enough to see what might already be coming. The convoy had enemies above, enemies below, enemies beside it, and the ice ahead. That is what made this route different. The Germans did not need to meet the convoy in open battle every time. The Arctic itself was already exhausting it, already slowing it, already turning men's hands numb before they touched weapons, already coating decks before the first aircraft appeared. The route Germany wanted to kill was not just a line on a map. It was a place where survival had to be earned mile by mile. And before the Luftwaffe appeared, before the U-boats fired, the Arctic had already begun taking men apart. Before the bombs, before the torpedoes, before the engines in the sky, there was the ice. It came quietly at first, a thin skin over metal, a hard edge forming on ropes, a white crust on rails, guns, ladders, and decks. Then it grew heavier. The Arctic did not attack like an army. It attacked like weather, like patience, like a hand closing slowly around the ship. Spray came over the bow, and where it landed, it froze. Men moved carefully because every surface could betray them. A slip could break bones. A rope could become stiff as iron. A gun could become difficult to work. A hatch could resist opening when time mattered most. The cold changed everything. It made simple work slow. It made hands clumsy. It made metal bite through gloves. It made breath freeze in the air. It turned watch duty into punishment. A man standing in the wind could feel the cold work its way through layers of clothing until it reached bone. And still the convoy moved. Merchant ships pushing forward through gray water. Escorts trying to hold formation, sailors watching sky and sea, waiting for something worse than weather to arrive. Because in the Arctic convoys, the cold was only the first enemy. Visibility could vanish. Fog could swallow the next ship in line. Snow could reduce the horizon to a wall of gray. Darkness could stretch for hours until men lost the sense of where sea ended and sky began. A ship could be close enough to matter and still almost disappear. From the German perspective, weather and geography were allies. The convoy was already tired before it was attacked, already slowed, already tense, already forced to fight the environment just to remain functional. German aircraft, submarines, and surface forces did not enter a neutral battlefield. They entered one where the Arctic had already begun weakening the men they intended to strike. For Canadian sailors, the experience was physical. Not a line in a report, not a statistic, physical, a frozen deck beneath boots, a weapon that needed clearing, a wave that came over the bow like a moving wall, an order shouted into wind and half lost before it reached the next man. The cold water was the worst threat of all. If a man went overboard, survival could be measured in minutes. If a ship was hit, the explosion was only part of the danger. The sea itself waited, black, freezing, indifferent. This is why the Arctic Convoy War should not be remembered as just another supply route. The route itself was a battle. Every mile demanded endurance. Every watch demanded focus. Every deck covered in ice reminded the sailors that the enemy did not always wear a uniform. Sometimes the enemy was temperature. Sometimes it was darkness. Sometimes it was a wave freezing where it landed. Canadian sailors and merchant seamen were not invincible. They were cold, tired, afraid, human, and still they worked. Still they cleared the ice. Still they stood watch. Still they kept the convoy moving toward Russia. Before the Luftwaffe appeared. Before the U-boats fired. Before the German guns found them. The Arctic had already begun taking men apart, and then the aircraft came. The first warning could come as a sound. Engines. Faint at first, almost hidden by wind, then louder, sharper, coming out of cloud, fog, or snow. On the convoy, men looked upward, not because they could always see the enemy. Often, they could not. The Arctic sky could hide aircraft until the last moments. Clouds could break suddenly. A shadow could appear where there had been only gray. And then the alarm would move through the ships. German aircraft came from the direction that made the route so dangerous. Norway, occupied, fortified, close enough to make the convoy lane a battlefield. For the German crews, the ships below were high-value targets, supplies for Russia, cargo for the Eastern Front. A convoy trapped between ice and coast, a line of slow vessels moving through weather that made maneuver difficult. For the sailors below, the attack came on top of everything else. The cold, the ice, the fog, the exhaustion. Men moved to guns already coated in freezing spray. Hands worked against metal that seemed to resist them. A deck that had been dangerous in calm moments now became a place where men had to run under attack. The convoy could not run like a single warship. A merchant ship could not twist and fight like a destroyer. The ships carried cargo. They were slow, heavy, vulnerable, and their survival depended on formation, escorts, gunners, discipline, and luck. Bombs fell into water. Columns of spray rose beside ships. The sea erupted white against black. A near miss could shake a hull, damage equipment, injure men, or flood compartments. A direct hit could turn a ship into fire in a world of ice. The escorts fired back. Guns flashed from icy decks. Tracer fire cut upward into gray sky. Men fought aircraft while standing on ships already fighting weather. This was not clean aerial combat. It was a cold collision of machines, men, and sea. From the German point of view, repeated air attacks could make the rout unbearable. A convoy hit often enough might scatter. A ship burning in the Arctic could slow the formation. A damaged escort might leave a gap. A merchant crew under fear might lose discipline. And every lost ship meant fewer supplies reaching Soviet ports. But the convoy could not afford to break. That was the brutal truth. If the ships scattered, they became easier to hunt. If they stopped, the cold and the enemy gained power. If formation collapsed, the route became even more dangerous. So the sailors held on. Canadian sailors among them, not alone, never alone, but present in that wider Allied line, working guns, holding watches, clearing ice, bracing against shock, trying to keep ships alive long enough to reach Russia. The convoy could not run. It had to survive in formation. And even after the aircraft disappeared into cloud, the men knew the attack might not be over. Because in the Arctic convoy war, danger came in layers. The sky had attacked them. Now the water was listening. After the aircraft disappeared, the convoy did not become safe. The sky had gone quiet, but the water had not. Somewhere beneath the Arctic Sea, German U-boats could still be waiting. That was the terror of this route. Danger did not come from one direction. It came from above, from below, from the coast, from the weather, from the ice, from the sea itself. A sailor could survive an air attack, return to his station, and still know that beneath the convoy, another enemy might be moving silently into position. For German U-boat crews, the Arctic route had its own cruel logic. The convoys were valuable. The weather was harsh. Visibility could be poor. Ships could become separated. Damage from aircraft or storms could create weakness. And every ship heading east mattered because every cargo hold could help the Soviet war effort. The U-boat did not need to defeat the entire convoy. It needed one opening, one ship falling behind, one escort pulled away, one moment when fog, ice, fear, or damage created a gap. Then the black water could become a killing ground. For the escorts, this meant the work never ended. After bombs came listening. After the sky came the sea. Men watched the horizon. Men watched the air. Men listened below the waterline. The convoy could not rest, because the Arctic did not offer pauses, only intervals between dangers. Canadian sailors were part of that listening war, part of the search, part of the watch, part of the endless suspicion that somewhere beneath the hulls, a submarine might already be calculating angle, distance, speed, and attack. The U-boats expected the conditions to help them. Cold exhausts men. Fog blinds men. Ice slows men. A damaged convoy becomes harder to control. And in that kind of environment, one submarine could create panic far larger than its own steel hull. But the convoy still had to move. That was the moral center of the Arctic War. Not charging forward, not conquering territory, not planting a flag, moving, holding formation, keeping the route alive, pushing cargo through a place where everything seemed designed to stop it. For the German crews beneath the water, the convoy was both target and risk. Every attack could reveal them. Every torpedo could invite pursuit. Every moment near the convoy could turn from hunt to survival. Because escorts were listening too. And if they found contact, the Arctic Sea could become a chamber of explosions. This was not the clean war of maps. On a map, the Arctic convoy route is a line. A thin line from west to east. But for the men on it, that line was made of cold, fear, and decisions made in seconds. A A ship turns, a contact is reported, a U-boat dives, a depth charge rolls away. Then everyone waits for the water to answer. The sky had attacked them. Now the water was listening. And beneath the ice road, the German submarines waited for the convoy to make one mistake. In the Arctic, stopping could be fatal. A ship alone was almost already lost. That was the truth every convoy sailor understood. The ocean was too cold, the route was too exposed, the enemy was too close, and the distance to safety was too far. A convoy survived by staying together. Slow ships, heavy ships, merchant ships carrying fuel, ammunition, trucks, food, aircraft parts, and everything else the war demanded. Escorts around them. Gunners on watch, signalmen waiting, lookouts scanning empty gray horizons, everyone depending on everyone else. But war tries to break systems. Germany understood that. An air attack could scatter ships. A U-boat strike could pull escorts away. Fog could separate a vessel from the line. Ice could slow a damaged ship. A frightened captain might turn too far. A burning ship could draw men toward rescue and away from defense. There were no easy choices. If a ship was hit, men might be freezing in the water. If an escort stopped to rescue them, the convoy's screen could weaken. If the escort stayed with the convoy, men in the sea might die. If the convoy slowed, the enemy gained time. If it scattered, the Arctic swallowed it piece by piece. This was the cruelty of convoy warfare. It forced men to measure duty against humanity. Rescue, pursuit, formation, survival. The decision could never be clean because the Arctic made every option brutal. Canadian sailors and merchant seamen were part of that system. They knew that discipline did not mean the absence of fear. It meant functioning through fear, standing watch while freezing, loading weapons while exhausted, holding course when the instinct was to turn away, keeping the convoy moving even when the sea itself seemed to be warning them to stop. From the German perspective, the goal was to break that cohesion. A convoy that stayed together was harder to kill. A convoy that scattered became a collection of isolated targets. So every attack tried to create separation, fear, smoke, damage, confusion, a gap, a ship alone. But the convoy system had one brutal strength. It did not depend on comfort. It did not depend on courage alone. It depended on procedure, formation, signals, watchkeeping, escort screens, and men doing their jobs even when cold, fear, and exhaustion were working against them. This was tactical adaptation in the frozen north, not elegant, not glorious, but necessary. The convoy became a moving machine of survival. Ships did not need to look heroic. They needed to arrive. Escorts did not need to destroy every enemy. They needed to keep the convoy alive long enough to reach port. That is why stopping was so dangerous. A stopped ship became easier to find. A slow ship became vulnerable. A separated ship became a question no one wanted to answer. Could anyone reach it? Could anyone save the men aboard? Could anyone do so without losing more ships? The Arctic punished hesitation. Germany punished separation. The weather punished weakness. And still the convoys moved, mile after mile, watch after watch, through ice, fog, darkness, and fear. In the Arctic, a ship alone was almost already lost. So the convoy held together. Because sometimes survival is not about speed. It is about refusing to break formation. The explosion was only the beginning. That is what made the Arctic so cruel. A bomb, a torpedo, or a shell could tear into a ship. But after the fire came the water. And in the frozen north, the water was another weapon. A ship hit in warmer seas was already in terrible danger. A ship hit in the Arctic faced something even darker. Fire on the deck, ice on the rails, smoke across freezing water, men thrown from stations, lifeboats difficult to launch, ropes frozen, hands numb, orders swallowed by wind. If men went into the sea, every second mattered. The cold did not wait. It did not care about rank. It did not care about courage. It did not care whether a man was Canadian, British, American, Soviet, German, or merchant navy. The water took heat, then strength, then movement, then consciousness. This part of the story must be told carefully, not as spectacle, not as shock, but as the human truth of the Arctic convoy war. For sailors on nearby ships, watching men in the water could be one of the worst moments of all, because rescue itself could become a trap. An escort that stopped might become a target. A ship that slowed could fall behind. A rescue attempt could expose more men to aircraft, submarines, or the freezing sea, and yet doing nothing was almost unbearable. Sometimes the right military decision and the human instinct to save a man were not pointing in the same direction. From the German view, a hit was success, a ship damaged, cargo lost, the convoy disrupted, fear increased. Every burning vessel proved the route could be punished. Every loss made the Murmansk Run more terrible. But for the men inside the convoy, a hit was not a statistic. Voices, a ship that had been there moments earlier. A column of smoke where a neighbor in the convoy used to be. A gap in the line. Canadian sailors witnessed this kind of danger as part of the wider Allied Arctic effort. They knew that survival did not always mean victory. Sometimes, survival meant reaching port with fewer ships than had started. Sometimes it meant carrying the memory of men who disappeared. Sometimes it meant unloading cargo, while already knowing the return voyage might be just as deadly. The Germans wanted the route to become unbearable, and moments like this made it feel unbearable. Fire in a world of ice. Men in water that did not forgive. Ships forced to choose between stopping and surviving. The explosion was only the beginning. The Arctic finished what the weapons started, and still the convoy moved, because the cargo had to reach Russia, because the route had to remain alive, because Germany could make the road deadly, but the Allies could not allow it to disappear. By the middle years of the Arctic Convoy War, Germany had proven one thing clearly: the route could be hurt, ships could burn, cargo could sink, sailors could die in freezing water, convoys could be scattered by weather, aircraft, submarines, and fear. But hurting a route was not the same as killing it. From the German side, the frustration became strategic. The Arctic route was supposed to be unbearable. The ice should have weakened the ships. The darkness should have hidden attackers. The fog should have broken coordination. Norway should have given Germany the striking position it needed. And repeated attacks should have made every voyage feel like a gamble no navy could continue forever. But the convoys kept coming, not untouched, not safe, not cleanly, but still moving. One convoy might suffer, another might arrive. One ship might be lost, another might reach Murmansk. One sailor might vanish into black water. Another would stand watch on the next voyage. That is the difference between terror and defeat. Germany made the Arctic route terrifying, but terror alone did not erase it. As long as ships still gathered, as long as escorts still formed around them, as long as merchant crews still sailed, as long as supplies still moved east, the route remained alive. For German commanders, this was the realization. The frozen corridor could be punished. It could be attacked from the air. It could be hunted from beneath the water. It could be threatened by surface forces. But it could not be made to disappear easily. The Allied system kept rebuilding itself around loss. This is where the enemy realization becomes larger than one battle. Germany was fighting not only ships, it was fighting a system. Ports, convoys, merchant sailors, naval escorts, air cover when available, repair crews, cargo handlers, commanders, weather reports, Allied cooperation, and the stubborn decision to keep sending ships into a route everyone knew could kill them. Canadian sailors and merchant seamen were part of that system. Not the whole system, not the only reason the route survived, but part of the human chain that kept it alive. A chain made of men on icy decks, men in engine rooms, men in merchant ships, men in escorts, men whose job was not to win fame, but to make sure the next convoy did not vanish. The German attacks mattered. The losses mattered. The fear mattered. No one should make the Arctic convoys sound easy, because they continued. Continuation was the achievement. To keep sailing after loss. To keep forming convoys after disaster. To keep sending men into a corridor Germany wanted to kill. Germany had made the road deadly, but the road was still open. And as long as that road remained open, supplies could still reach Russia. The Arctic had not been conquered. The German attacks had not been harmless. But the convoy route still lived. And behind that survival were sailors whose names rarely became famous. Including Canadians fighting at the frozen edge of a war most people never learned. When Canadians remember the Second World War, the images often come from land: Juno Beach, Dieppe, Ortona, the Scheldt, the Netherlands, infantry in mud, tanks on roads, liberated towns, flags, memorials, names carved into stone. But some Canadian stories were written far from land, far from crowds, far from towns that could be liberated, far from battlefields where victory could be photographed clearly. Some stories were written on water so cold it could kill a man in minutes, in fog, in darkness, on ships where ice formed faster than men could clear it. This was Canada's forgotten Arctic Convoy War. Canadian sailors and merchant seamen served as part of a wider Allied effort to keep supplies moving to the Soviet Union. Some served on merchant ships. Some served in naval crews and escort operations connected to the Arctic route. Some were part of the larger convoy world that stretched from Canadian ports to Britain, from Britain to northern waters, and onward toward Russia. Their war was not always dramatic in the obvious way. It was not one great charge, not one decisive hill, not one famous beach. It was endurance repeated until endurance became history. A watch in freezing wind, a gun cleared of ice, a rope cut from frost, a signal lamp blinking through fog, a convoy line held together when the weather wanted to scatter it. The Arctic sailors faced an enemy before Germany even appeared. The cold. Then Germany came too. Aircraft from Norway, U-boats beneath the convoy lane, warship threats in the northern seas, bombs, torpedoes, mines, ice, fog, darkness, distance, all converging on ships that still had to move. This is what makes the story so important. It shows a different Canada at war, not Canada advancing through Europe, not Canada holding a beach, not Canada clearing a town, Canada at sea, Canada in the frozen north, Canada inside a multinational lifeline running toward the Eastern Front. These men were not invincible. They were cold, tired, afraid, sometimes seasick, sometimes silent, sometimes so used to danger that fear became part of the routine. But routine did not make the danger smaller. It only meant they had learned to work inside it. Their role should not be exaggerated. Canada did not keep the Arctic convoys alive alone. The route belonged to a vast Allied effort. British, Canadian, American, Soviet merchant, naval and air forces all had their place in the story. But Canada's part deserves to be remembered because the men were there, because they sailed, because they endured, because the frozen convoy war was part of Canada's wider Second World War experience. They did not fight on a famous beach. They fought on a road of ice and black water, and every mile survived on that road meant supplies had moved closer to the Soviet Union. Every convoy that arrived helped keep pressure on Germany from the east. Every sailor who stood watch in that cold became part of a war larger than himself. That is the final proof. Not a single glorious victory, but a route kept alive through repeated suffering. A convoy system that kept moving despite the ice, despite the enemy, despite the dead, despite the fear. Canada's forgotten Arctic sailors deserve a place beside the battles Canadians already know. Because before victory could be measured on maps, men had to keep the supply lines alive in places where the map itself looked frozen. Return to the Barents Sea, night, wind, black water moving under a sky without warmth, a convoy half lost in fog, a sailor standing watch beside a rail coated in ice. Somewhere to the north, the ice pack. Somewhere to the south, German-held Norway. And between them, ships moving because history required them to move. That was the frozen convoy war. Not clean, not easy, not famous enough. A war of ice on the deck, fog in the eyes, cold in the lungs, explosions in the distance, and men doing their work in a place where survival itself could feel like defiance. Germany could attack from Norway. Aircraft could come from cloud. U-boats could wait beneath the water. Surface ships could threaten the route. The Arctic could freeze weapons, slow hands, blind lookouts, and turn the sea into a death sentence. But the convoys kept moving. That is the memory that matters. Not that the route was safe. It was not. Not that every ship arrived. They did not. Not that Canada carried the burden alone. It did not. But that Canadian sailors and merchant seamen were part of the men who crossed that frozen corridor when crossing it mattered. They carried supplies. They carried duty. They carried fear. They carried exhaustion. And sometimes they carried the memory of ships that no longer followed behind them. The Arctic route was not a battlefield of flags and hills. It was a battlefield of distance, weather, cargo, convoys, and endurance. A place where the enemy was Germany, and the sea, and the cold, and the constant knowledge that one mistake, one hit, one fall into the water could end everything. The ice was already fighting them before Germany fired a shot, and still, they sailed. The Canadian sailors of the Frozen Convoy War deserve to be remembered beside every battlefield Canada knows, because the ice remembers what history too often forgets.